This is Vanessa Irena, and I'm really excited to announce my new store, Sword and Scythe, where I'll be offering magical art, materia, and services beneath Mars and Saturn. You can visit the store at swordandscythe.com and be sure to sign up for the email list to receive early access to new releases.
Speak the charm of nature.
There will come a time on the planet Earth when science and technology will be long forgotten. When wizards will rule the world.
This is the Arnemancy Podcast. The world is weirder than we know. Join your host, Reverend Derek, and his diverse array of amazing guests in an exploration of tarot, magic, the occult, and the history of Western esotericism. The Arnemancy Podcast exists thanks to the support of generous listeners like you. Please consider supporting this podcast for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/Arnemancy. Okay, welcome back to the podcast. This is your host, Reverend Eric. I am here today with Michael Sanborn, who has just released a new translation of a Rémi Boyer book called From the Doctrine of Reintegration to the Imago Templi. Michael is a translator and book designer with a particular interest in European initiatory traditions. If you haven't heard my previous interview with him, I would encourage you to go back and listen to that before listening to this, or just dive into this. We'll do a little bit of an intro so you get an idea of what we're discussing, and then we're just going to dive into some weird stuff. Michael, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Eric. I really appreciate having you over. It's always fun to talk with you.
Yeah, we're hanging out in Michael's dining room area, which totally looks like it would be perfect for a seance. And we're hopped up on kava.
That's true. And we'll be drinking more kava as the day goes along.
Yes. All right. So the last time I interviewed you, you had finished translating 3 books from Rémi Boyer.
If not 4.
Maybe 4. It was definitely a lot. It was a lot. I remember you were sort of being like, interview would be great. Here's some material. And I'm like, ooh, that's only like 10,000 pages to read. And you were just explaining to me that those are different than the material we're working on now, or that you were working on now in this latest book. And that stuff was more, if I remember correctly, a lot of it was kind of Rosicrucian or sort of 19th century Rosicrucian stuff.
Why don't I just lay it out for you?
Okay, let's hear it.
So this is the 5th book that I'm translating by Rémi Boyer. And for branding consistency, let me just mention that this cover is pretty much reproduced from the French edition, where the subtitle is in large letters and the title is in tiny letters. And I just decided to go for that. So the actual title of the book is The Rectified Scottish Rite, subtitle From the Doctrine of Reintegration to the Imago Templi. But would you know that from looking at the cover? Not necessarily. I don't blame you a bit.
It does make sense, though.
Yes.
That makes a lot more sense. I'm really glad that that's the title. That's the subtitle.
we keep people on their toes. So the first 3 books that I translated are called the Ways of Awakening Trilogy, and they are sort of introductions or reintroductions of 3 different European initiatory traditions through the lens specifically of awakening, to some extent derived from Eastern non-dual schools, but also pointing out how those same ways of awakening are found in Western traditions. For instance, Meister Eckhart comes up as someone who lucidly spoke of the path of awakening and the path of non-duality in Western terms. And these specifically were, to begin with, Freemasonry as a way of awakening, an introduction to Freemasonry from a very particular point of view of personal development and growth. Then Mask, Cloak, Silence, Martinism as a way of awakening, which has been credited sometimes with being as opposed to Martinist original source material translated into English, possibly the first book about Martinism as such to appear in English. And thirdly, Beneath the Veil of Elias Artista, the Rose Croix as a Way of Awakening, which had to do with Rosicrucianism, but specifically an Iberian, Spanish, and Portuguese derivation of Rosicrucianism that has a flavor of its own, rather distinct from the German and Bohemian Rosicrucianism that is more often talked about in English in most places, I think.
Oh, yeah.
So after that trilogy came out, then over the course of the pandemic and the lockdown, there were a series of letters that came out by the same author, Rémi Boyer, offering contemporary reflections on initiatory tradition in general, a particular focus on Martinism, but also Freemasonry, the Rose Croix, Swedenborgianism, and a whole lot more. And these were all collected in a book called Letters to Friends of the Spirit. And I think that was what I had just published right before our last interview. And so now, with the latest book, The Rectified Scottish Rite, From the Doctrine of Reintegration to the Imago Templi, this is, again, like the first three books, reflecting on a particular initiatory tradition, but I think even more particular than the trilogy dealt with, not just Freemasonry like the first book, but specifically the Rectified Scottish Rite. But again, approaching it from the point of view of ways of awakening and the particular take on initiatory tradition of being itself, of the nature of consciousness that infused the other books. But in this one, going into more detail, relying on the audience to be more committed to getting into more of the technical nitty-gritty while still keeping an extremely wide lens to the metaphysics of initiation.
Okay. Yeah. All right. That's a really broad array of initiatory traditions that are all, very specifically European, I guess, calling them broad within Europe. All right. So yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it is Letters of the Friends of the Spirit. That's the one I remember that you had just come out with. I am really interested in the Rectified Scottish Rite. I'm fairly active in the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite in American Masonry.
Yeah.
And it has, its degrees have a tradition mostly of being like rewritten, and I don't want to get in trouble for saying this, but rewritten and dumbed down like a lot. And I think we probably have more degrees. It really collected a lot of them and sort of chopped them down. So there are, 32 degrees. The first three never ever get used. Instead, we use the English or the American system for that. But it's interesting because just in hearing you talk about it, I think one of the things that's going to be very unfamiliar to most mainstream Masons who are part of the Scottish Rite or listening to this is the southern jurisdiction's degrees are kind of really specifically telling us there's no secret wisdom being passed on here. There's no occult lore. And it's very interesting to hear that said over and over in the same degrees that are sort of like, now we're going to talk about Kabbalah for, a minute and a half, but the way that you're sort of talking about the Rectified Scottish Rite it sort of sounds like a true initiatory system or a true system of awakening. Can you talk a little bit just from like the technical standpoint of the structure of the Rectified Scottish Rite? Like, what does it look like?
Yes, absolutely. I do want to say that, as with any organization, some manifestations of it are deeper, some are more superficial, from what I understand. And I should make a disclaimer from the very beginning. I have some direct experience with certain initiatory paths, but I am not myself a member of the Rectified Scottish Rite. So I am talking from the point of view of someone who has spent, a year or so translating this particular book very carefully, and have some experience in related aspects of the current founded by Martinez de Pasqually. But I don't want anyone to get the impression that I'm speaking as a member of the Rectified Scottish Rite.
Okay. Yeah. As far as I know, it's difficult or impossible to find Rectified Scottish Rite degrees being conferred in the United States.
Yeah, definitely. But if you can go outside the United States and you can speak another language besides English, it's definitely out there. About the structure, right? French, of course, above all, but also Spanish and Portuguese, Italian, and probably others.
Yeah. All right.
As far as the structure goes, we have the first 3 degrees, your Blue Lodge degrees, that are a little different than what you find in the mainstream English lodges. They have, as all of the degrees have, a specifically Christian orientation. In this rite, you are asked to declare yourself a Christian, and that can be interpreted different ways depending on the particular environment. As I understand it, at the very least, you have to have the view that when you're at the point of unifying with everything and recognizing the true religion in your experience, that Christendom is not in any way contradictory to your understanding of true religion, even if your understanding of true religion isn't exclusive to Christianity. Now, that's being more postmodern than the original. Yeah,
I'm trying to get those two things to agree in my head.
I think that there are some people who are spiritual and not religious, and yet would say, when it comes to Christianity, that can't quite possibly jibe with what I believe as the total truth. But I think that from a point of view of transcending the distinctions of the mind, one could see there's a way of seeing Christian doctrine as an expression of the total truth, while at the same time being able to recognize other things as the total truth.
Okay.
Buddhism, for instance.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. All right. I have a really specific question now.
Okay. I'll come back to finishing the initial question that you asked, which I only began to touch on.
Okay.
But go ahead.
Okay. I'm just sort of curious about the contents of the Blue Lodge degrees. You said that they're very specifically Christian. In some of the Scottish Rite Blue Lodge degrees that I have seen, there is an emphasis on like very pagan gods who stand at some of the major stations in the lodge. You know, there's like I think Heracles and Aphrodite and like I can't remember all of them, but there's like pagan gods who sort of stand at the stations. Does that happen in these ones then? Interesting. Okay. I'm going to have to look more into the history of that because I'm not sure where that came from. Okay, well,
let me just mention that the point that I often raise is that while the Rectified Scottish Rite, the degrees, were written after the Rite of Perfection, on which the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite is based, they are certainly written before the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. The Rectified Scottish Rite is prior to the ancient and accepted.
Yeah,
Scottish
that makes
Rite.
sense because the sort of base degrees of the accepted Scottish Rite are from Pike, and he probably wrote those in the 1860s, 1870s.
Right. So this is between the 1790s and the 1910s.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean 1810s.
Yeah, I think the original Scottish Rite stuff that Pike was using came from like 1794 or something like that, like we have a few different manuscripts. It's confusing.
Right. And in general, the Rectified Scottish Rite bears very little resemblance to the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, although there is a relationship to Templarism in both.
Oh, okay. All right. That'll be interesting to talk about. Yeah, I was. That's definitely something I wanted to talk about a little bit further on.
But
okay.
let me finish the structure.
Exactly.
So 3 degrees of more or less corresponding to the Blue Lodge, and I think it is even called Blue Lodge in Rectified Scottish Rite, and then a 4th degree that completes the 3, that is the Scottish Master of St. Andrew. And this is sometimes called the Green Lodge.
Yeah.
And this, from my research, seems to be related to the ritual that is rumored to have been what Bonnie Prince Charlie was given in Holyrood in Scotland to name him the head of the Scottish Order of the Templars, and by implication the Grand Master of all Masonry, as far as that context goes. And so this was the first time this ritual was ever performed, and then later it became known as the Scottish Master of St. Andrew. Some people believe there's also a relationship between that and what later became known as the Royal Arch in other rites.
Okay, that's interesting. In the accepted Scottish Rite, we have a Knight of St. Andrew degree, which I don't think claims to be the Scottish Master degree, which is sort of looked at as different, but there is a Knight of St. Andrew degree that we call the KSA, it's right. Yeah, they end up people who dedicate themselves to the KSA end up doing lots of dishwashing. we need it, which we need.
So supposedly, at the point of the 4th degree, deserving candidates would be discreetly informed that there were further degrees, secret degrees, and at the edge of the gateway to those, you would be letting go of your Masonic identity and going into a chivalric identity as a squire novice of the Knights Beneficent of the Holy City, or Chevalier Bienfaisant de la Cité Santé. And being a knight squire would be in preparation to becoming a full-fledged Knight Beneficent of the Holy City. And this is even more Christian. It is contemplative. It is archetypally related to the Templars, but it's important to note that from the very inception of the Rectified Scottish Rite, they said that they do not claim any lineal descendant from the Templars or any claim to the treasure or properties of the Templars, and that in general that whole thing is, well, the word we'd use for it is toxic. But they used other language for it, but essentially they said, we want no part of that trend in Templarism. And yet we have this affiliation of desire with what I would call the archetype or the type of the Templar heritage, the defending the pilgrims to the Holy City, defending the pilgrims to goodness, to the mystical guidance of the divine. Oh, I really like that. Sort of looking at the Holy City as a metaphor for some sort of spiritual attainment. Absolutely. Oh, that's way better. And some select people of this, now we're at 6th degree, the Knights Beneficent of the Holy City, might be discreetly informed that there was another secret degree called the Professed. And they would get an instruction an instruction that, just might be translated and published in English for the first time in the book that I've just published, the Rectified Scottish Rite, that has the instruction of the professed in its whole, translated and double-checked from the original manuscripts from the museum,
that is
Municipal Museum of Lyon, I believe. Then perhaps some of those professed might find out that there is one final secret degree called the Grand Professed, and get some instructions, one part of which, not the entirety, but the second part, the one that's most interesting from the point of view of this book, is also translated from the original manuscripts in this book.
And I imagine it is the Grand Professed who learns about the Imago Templi, or is given the Imago Templi?
Well, the Imago Templi is everywhere. So it could be argued that every Freemason contributes or participates in the Imago Templi. If you hear temple and you're not just thinking of a thing of stone, but your soul twitches, then you hear the call of the Imago Templi.
I believe that is the goal of every type of Freemasonry that I have come across.
Well, there we go.
With maybe the exception of very modern English Freemasonry.
Yeah. Or, the people who are want the ceremony but are stone cold skeptics for some reason. Then they're not participating in the Imago Templi.
I feel like American Freemasonry has found a way around that, and it tricks them into continuing to participate just through the heavy emphasis on memory work. But I've got theories about that, and this is not my interview. So,
but if the heart quickens at a certain point into the depths of being by whatever means, if the soul is meeting the divine, then there the temple is also.
Right. Yeah. All right. So you just outlined, what was that, 8 degrees altogether?
Yes.
And is that the entirety of them?
Yes. And an important thing to note here is that they are all written in the same scope of time. So they are an integrated matched set. It's not like I think most rites where 1 degree is written at one time and another degree is written at another, and then maybe later there's an attempt to plane them so that they seem to fit. These are integral components of one another.
I mean, it sounds like they tell sort of a complete story. I love that thing where you get to the 6th degree, and then they're like, you know what? Maybe there is a 7th. I don't know. But it's so short. That's so much more manageable. The Scottish Rite being 32 degrees. It's great, but even people who've been doing it forever, you're like, what's the 14th degree again? And people stand around in a circle being like,
Yeah, and all the more so if you're talking about Memphis Mizraim, and it's 97 to 101 degrees.
Yeah, although I've heard, or at least some of the stuff that I've read, says that after 33, they have degrees every 11 degrees, and all the ones in between are just sort of like, right, don't know if those
vapor,
exist. Vaporware degrees. Okay, well, that's that emphasis on chivalric masonry so soon, and so being such a major part of the system is really fascinating. The only chivalric degrees that I've ever really had experience with are the last few in the accepted Scottish Rite. Which, and I have no idea how to compare them to anything else. So, I'm not able to take the York Rite chivalric degrees because I'm not Christian. And so, can you talk a little bit about what a chivalric degree seems to mean? I know you've covered that a little bit already, talking about sort of the guardians to the holy city, or of pilgrims to the holy city, but what is kind of the form of a chivalric degree? Are there swords?
Well, sure, there are swords.
Oh, yeah.
What comes up for me is that there's an ethical code that comes up from trying to be a represent or an agent of the work that God wants to see in the world, while also not becoming puffed up and trying to take credit for the goodness of that oneself. So the following the fine line of ethical aspiration and self-emptying that is required of a warrior knight.
Right. Okay. The ethical code itself, does that come from? Is it drawn mainly from Christianity? Because the sort of de-Christianized version of Freemasonry draws a lot of its ethical code from like pre-Christian stuff like Aristotle, or even like early Christian fathers instead of like a more modern Christianity. And I'm wondering, like, where do you think what are the origins of the ethical code, or what is it does it have like points? Are there specific virtues that you focus on or something of that nature?
Well, I think ultimately it's the silent and mysterious guidance of the divine.
Oh.
It is true, though, that in the earlier degrees, in the first 4 degrees, say, there are things that are written down, things that are in language to orient the initiate to the inner journey that will lead ultimately to the inner mystical guidance that is to be the orientation for them in the future in their beneficence and in the work that the inner order calls them to do. But these are temporary measures to bring you up to that point where language is no longer suitable, because it's the message of your inner guidance in relation to whatever is happening at the time. So it's not anything that's repeatable. It's spontaneous and innocent.
Or there's a much heavier emphasis on mysticism than there is in the more mainstream American Freemasonry. That's kind of interesting.
It's completely mystical, or if it's not yet mystical, it is laying the groundworks for mysticism.
So from and this is how it's being practiced currently, like in the modern form.
Well, again, I think that it comes out in different manifestations depending on the traditions. I think that there are some, as I hear people talk about it in European contexts, there are some places where, well, this is very mundane the way this particular lineage practices it. They go through the scripts, but do they really understand them? And then there are some, wow, they are very mystical. And then there are concerns from other Masons, like, are these people Masons or are they wizards? Are they sorcerers?
Why not both?
Yeah, but so it's very much its own kind of thing, its own kind of tradition. Some of them, and I think that it's particularly the heritage of Martinez de Pasqually, that for some traditions, Pasqually is just a distraction. Or I guess they say, I've always said Pasqually, but I think in Europe they always say Martinez. Martinez is just a distraction. Whereas from the point of view of this book, that it's essentially Martinezist.
Say that one again.
Martinezist.
Which is not Martinist.
It's related.
Yeah.
But it's not exactly this. And that you have to be able to appreciate the foundations of it, the Martinezist foundations of it, to understand the Rectified Scottish Rite, and certainly to be able to appreciate what's going on with the professed and the grand professed. Those instructions are explicitly, I shouldn't say explicitly, but it's overtly would be a better way of saying it. Okay. Ways of introducing Martinezist doctrine into a Masonic context.
Can you maybe give us the 101 on Martinez de Pasqually? Like that? it's a name that is brought up all the time, but those who aren't really familiar with sort of like the history of this particular branch of mysticism, it's one of those names that from the outside you see it all the time, but you don't really know what it's about. Kind of like, this is a horrible comparison, but sort of like if you knew nothing about the OTO and you'd hear the name Aleister Crowley, but you'd be like, I don't know what he's about. So can you give us a little bit of the 101? Like, who was this dude?
Right. Well, the first thing that always comes up for me is the concept of crazy wisdom, which is something you especially hear about in Tibetan Buddhism, but that there are certain spiritual masters who are more committed to transmitting the truth as they understand it than following social convention. Chongyang Trungpa, back in the 60s and early 70s, was someone who was outrageous in so many ways, and yet he was considered to be an avatar. Mullah Nasruddin from the traditional Sufi stories.
Ooh, I've got some Nasruddin stories.
Well, excellent. So you know that he's completely defying expectation, but always communicating something of profound wisdom. And Martinez de Pasqually strikes me as very much this kind of person. His writings are difficult to understand, although they're in French. French is not his first language. It's not really known what his first language was.Maybe he didn't have a first language. Maybe every language was his second language. And he appeared in the early to mid 1700s. I shouldn't say early, but mid 1700s with a paten to hold a form of Freemasonry that was largely magical, largely theurgic. And he claimed that he was transmitted it exactly as he learned it from his father, but it is so unlike anything else. And the Masonic group that he founded was called the Knights Masons Elu Cohen of the Universe. And my interpretation of it, and there are people who are doing Elu Cohen reconstructionist work who have very specific interpretations of what's going on, and there may not be complete agreement with my spin on it, but it is in a way of ceremonially reproducing the history of the Jewish people in a visionary sense within one's own being and through an initiatory sequence. And part of that, at a certain point, involves banishing specific negative spirits, exorcisms, that sort of thing, and at a certain point, invoking specific positive spirits to aid you in your work, ultimately leading to an ultimate degree of the Rue Croix, not the Rose Croix, but the Rue, which in itself it's not a normal French word, Old French, kind of meaning rose, kind of meaning royal, a kind of meaning a shade of red, something like scarlet. And it was to those people he addressed the one writing that we have of his, the Treatise on the Reintegration of Beings, that was dictated to Saint Martin, Louis-Claude de Saint Martin, who was his secretary. And they eventually got it to the point where it was something that could be distributed, even though it was never completely finished. But this work of the Elu Cohen involved a massive amount of theurgic work, and his secretary and most advanced student, Saint Martin, at a certain point decided that there must be a way of bringing initiates to the fruition of their quest without the burden of all of this theurgy, and started teaching from a more contemplative point of view, more closely related to pietism. And then he discovered the works of Jakob Böhme, and so Martinism then became a synthesis of Martinez de Pasqually and Jakob Böhme. And that was the later teachings of Saint Martin, and became the beginnings of the Martinism that we know today.
Huh.
The other chief student of Pasqually, Martinez de Pasqually, was Jean-Baptiste Willermoz, who was a friend and colleague of Saint Martin as well. And he was very committed to Freemasonry in a lot of different forms. And at a certain point, he became acquainted with the Templar strict observance.
Out of Germany?
Yeah. And he was the one to bring that into France. And then as they reformed it, that is what became the Rectified Scottish Rite. As they reformed it for French sensibilities, he brought in the doctrines of Martinez de Pasqually to create the Rectified Scottish Rite, which is kind of ironic because as I understand it, part of the thrust of the strict observance was to move Freemasonry away from magical influences and other things that were peripheral to Freemasonry. And so they bring it into France, and then in the later versions of it, specifically add aspects of the theurgy of the Elucoan into the inner degrees of the Rectified Scottish Rite.
Huh. That's I love this is a part of Masonic history that I really, really love because well, first of all, for those of you who are listening, there wasn't really like a Germany at the time. There was, the Holy Roman Empire, and it was just a ridiculous political mess. Tons and tons of tiny little principalities and, city-states and republics and theocracies and, duchies and kingdoms, like all squished together in a way that didn't really work. If you're familiar at all with Freemasonry, you know that a lot of times Masonic organizations, like Grand Lodges in particular, like follow political boundaries. Mm-hmm. And in the Holy Roman Empire, that didn't work very well. So there were lots and lots of Grand Lodges and rites and things sort of like vying for control of German Freemasonry. And at the end of the 1700s, the three big ones were the strict observance, I think they're usually called the Golden Rosicrucians, but they have like some fancier, longer name, and the Illuminati. Mm-hmm. And all of them kind of collapsed around the same time. Like they all just sort of screwed up and just ruined things for each other kind of right around the same time, like in the 1790s, and they all just sort of vanished.
And in the manifestation, how it manifested in France was the Rectified Scottish Rite became the mainstream high-degree Freemasonry for France.
For all of it?
Yeah.
Oh, I just thought France was already pretty segmented at the time too, but maybe not.
It's not saying that there weren't other degrees, but the dominant one for upper degree high degree Masonry was the Rectified Scottish Rite, and in some ways it continues to be.
Huh. Wow. Yeah, that's interesting.
Just to finish the thread about Pasqually, Martinez de Pasqually, that. Before the Rectified Scottish Rite was being composed, Martinez de Pasqually inherited some land in Haiti or Santo Domingo. Anyway, the West Indies, and he went to take care of it, and he died under mysterious circumstances. And or I shouldn't. We don't understand. There's no record of exactly how it was that he died.
That's mysterious circumstances for sure. Conspiracy theorists, take note.
And although at that point, the Elucoan were gathering steam. Once he was gone, it started puttering out pretty rapidly. And so then the heritage of the Martinezist doctrine had to go through Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin and Jean-Baptiste Willermoz.
Yeah, okay. That's cool.
At this point, Michael and I had to take an impromptu break and decided to have a second bowl of kava.
Oh, yeah. All right. Would you like to explain the kava ritual to our listeners?
Oh, sure. This is people in different parts of the Pacific consume kava differently. As I understand it, this is one of the ways that they do it in Vanuatu. And it involves clapping once to invite in the spirits of the ancestors, chugging the kava, and then clapping twice to dispel any negative spirits.
Let's do it.
All right.
Ooh. All right. So the flavor of kava.
Yes.
Oh.
Intoxicating mud.
Mm.
It's a great thing.
One of the great things about it, though, is that, like, we have a little piece of pineapple straight after.
Mm-hmm.
The pineapple tastes so unsweet. Like, it's countering the bitter weirdness of the kava mud, and it sort of expends all of its sweetness on that. But
it's true.
It does a good job. And then, yeah. Okay, so where were we? We were in around 1790s. Isn't that when de Pasqually came to the Caribbean?
When exactly? It's probably before the 1790s, but after the 1760s. Do I have the exact date on me? No, I don't.
Okay.
But it's in there.
Yeah, that was also around the time that the early manuscripts of what became the Accepted Scottish Rite, or the sort of ancestors of it, the degrees that ended up being developed, started cropping up.
Mm-hmm.
And I think actually what we call the Franken manuscripts, which became the Accepted Scottish Rite eventually, came from the Caribbean.
Oh, okay, yeah, I think I've heard that too.
Yeah, so there could be, I'm sure there's probably people who try to make that connection between Pasqually and the Accepted Scottish Rite, but doesn't sound like it's even close to the same sort of degree structure.
Right. No. But there is that sense that there is a more authentic form of Freemasonry other than what those accursed English people are doing.
Yeah, you were talking about that earlier too. You were calling English Freemasonry Hanoverian Freemasonry.
Because there is this particular quality to English culture after George I comes in place. Old forms of piety are out. Science is in. The Royal Society, Newtonian physics, and trade, commerce, and the new is in.
Right.
And the Freemasonry that... but the other important part about that is that the Hanoverians are not Stuarts.
That's true.
And so there is a strong connection between the origins of Freemasonry and the House of Stuart. And it was important to create a new history for Freemasonry that distanced it from the Stuarts. And this is what happens with the Anderson's
Constitutions. Yeah, 1723.
And this is the beginning of what I'm calling Hanoverian Freemasonry, where you can be mystical, but it's not required. You can be religious, but it's not required. You can be interested in trade. You can be interested in progress. You can be interested in science. That is the new hotness.
Yeah. I mean, the religion, it was still very religious.
By our standards.
Yeah, by our standards. That's true. Yeah. And so that's something that, continental Freemasonry, that's funny. From the side of what you're calling Hanoverian Freemasonry, a lot of times we refer to it as English Freemasonry or British Freemasonry and continental Freemasonry.
Sure.
And continental Freemasonry, when looked at from the outside, is also split up into like conservative and liberal branches, right? So there are, and this sounds like actually kind of more of a conservative branch because of the way that it sort of centers religion so strongly. Because there's a lot of modern Freemasonry, or not even modern, like as old as this stuff, coming out of the continent that focuses on freedom of conscience, and doesn't require any sort of religious stuff. Some of which just strips it out entirely, and it's like they have a blank book on the altar, and they're like, who cares if you've got religion? Just come and be a Mason.
But what's forgotten is that before the French Revolution, there was a reaction to the Enlightenment in the skeptical free-thinking sense. That in some places manifested itself as a retreat to hardcore tradition and Catholicism, like insisting that Catholicism has to defeat everything else.
Right.
But there was also freaky, wild experimentation going on with the mesmerists, and all the crazy things that were going on exploring consciousness, and the Swedenborgians, seeing what was going on in the spirit world and how those interacted in various crazy ways, like the Illuminates of Avignon that went completely bonkers and sort of immolated themselves in a stew of extremism.
And you do what you gotta.
Right. And certainly Martinez de Pasqually is a part of that whole, and the Martinezism is one facet of that whole thing, a very important part of what in France became known as Illuminism. And so I think that's a good way of thinking of it, that Martinezism, Martinism, and the Rectified Scottish Rite are all manifestations of Illuminism. And this is conservative in the sense that it's reacting against the free thinking of people like Voltaire, but it's radical in the sense that they're daring to delve into mysticism in a very brave way, in a way that more conventional religious people would avoid or even consider heretical.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. A lot of times when we learn about, sort of like Enlightenment era philosophy, we're sort of told that the counter-Enlightenment is Romanticism. And that has always seemed to be very narrow, given the stuff that was going on, like the amount of theurgy and, magical work. And I guess we should probably also remember that most of the magic in Europe at the time was super Christian.
Yeah. And this is the Rectified Scottish Rite is absolutely a part of that whole movement.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I hope that some French Masons listen to this and have some input into some of the Rectified Scottish Rite stuff that's going on, in their lodges today. That would be really, really interesting to hear from some of them. So if you're out there, French Masons, send me an email.
I should possibly recommend a conversation that I had with Jose Anez, and this is something that we did on the Sapere Aude Masonic YouTube channel, that also in promotion of this book, we presented to that group. And Jose Anez is the past Grand Prior of the Lusitanian Rectified Scottish Rite. And he had a lot of very interesting things to say about the tradition, about this book. He's a friend of the author, Rémi Boyer. And I gave an outline of the book also, but I thought to hear firsthand from him and how deeply it has impressed him and moved him over the course of his life. That was some beautiful information to take on.
Okay, I will have a link to that in the show notes, so that when our listeners are done listening to us, they can go check that out. I
should mention that Jose Anez also writes one of the prefaces in our current book, The Rectified Scottish Rite, from the Doctrine of Reintegration to the Imago Templi.
All right. Well, let's talk. So the Doctrine of Reintegration.
Yes.
What does that mean necessarily? It sounds to me like a theurgic practice.
In the context of the Elucoan, it absolutely was.
Okay.
And this could be something to investigate over the course of a lifetime. And I've been investigating it for 5-6 years now. So bear with me. I will have a different opinion about this a year from now.
Okay.
But one can picture the treatise on reintegration of Martinez de Pasqually as being a synthesis of the Hermetic great man and the Kabbalistic Adam Kadmon, that is the prior identity of all humanity, that through, something happened And we now find ourselves in the multiplicity and sometimes suffering that is the human condition, and that the course of personal development, the course of development on self, has to do with recognizing the fragmentation that is our lot and coming back to that unity that is our primordial state, recognizing it even in the midst of our relative multifaceted lives. And this can be done through theurgy. If you're a Martinist, it can be done through contemplation and reflection of the heart. And if you're a member of the Rectified Scottish Rite, it can be done through beneficence, or so says this book.
That's a tough one to synthesize, too.
Well, I often use the word anthropos.
Anthropos.
Yeah. So we have the great man.
Right.
But it's helpful because anthropos isn't gender specific.
Yeah. But that's sort of the capital M man from the Corpus Hermeticum, where you sort of have this, you have like the divine and then man and nature and that sort of stuff. And one of the things that the Hermeticist is supposed to do is, I guess, reintegrate with that. Okay, that makes sense. All right. The Imago Templi itself, then, what role does it necessarily play in the reintegration? Does the Imago Templi then sort of a stand-in for the great man / Adam Cadman, or is it something more?
Wherever we as entities encounter the divine is the temple. The temple is the meeting place. And that happens when we find ourselves as whatever. Do we find ourselves as our everyday person? Do we find ourselves as someone in a great state of loss and deprivation? Do we find ourselves as a elevated, out of the body, luminous being in a rare contemplative state? But in any of those cases, we can encounter the divine, and at that moment, that is the temple, and the role that plays in our life is the image of the temple, and that is a motivating force for us individually and collectively when we consider the thrust of the history of the Jewish people. They're motivated by the Imago Templi. When we think about the Crusades, they are motivated by the Imago Templi. When we think about the teachings of Swedenborg, who felt that the age of the Holy Spirit was beginning with the infusion of these teachings from the celestial beings to himself, that is the Imago Templi, or the New Jerusalem, the Nova Hierosolyma, as Swedenborg would say. The Arthurian mythos, the Grail mythos, that is the Imago Templi. The Parsifal of Chrétien de Troyes, of von Eschenbach, Wolfram von Eschenbach, and even of Wagner, there is that Imago Templi. And I want to particularly point out the original essay by Henry Corbin called the Imago Templi in Confrontation with Secular Norms, which can be found in the collection Temple and Contemplation, which is, I believe, where Imago Templi was coined. And certainly the writer of this book is intimately familiar with Henry Corbin, and it's just the best essay. So I always take a moment to recommend to people to find that essay and to read it. It gives a perspective on the whole course of the Western soul that is unlike anything you can find anywhere else. And then it turns out, after I was so motivated years ago from reading this essay, that Henry Corbin was an initiate of the Rectified Scottish Rite. And it is very, likely that it's no coincidence.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It also makes me think of, there's definitely an image of the temple in English Freemasonry, or at least in American Freemasonry. I don't know how much it's maintained in modern English Freemasonry, but it also made me think of like the crystal palaces of Teresa of Avila. Is that her name? Who wrote, who had these like images, these mystical images of visiting the divine in these crystal palaces that are just like beautifully described. And I think she's like 13th or 14th century. But that's really interesting reading too. That metaphor of a building as a divine meeting place is strangely prevalent across Western mysticism. Like it seems to crop up everywhere, and I think it's also where most of our sacred geometry fascination comes from. The geometers were the builders. That's fascinating.
Absolutely. So it's a common thread.
It is. Yeah, that's really cool.
So about the book,
yes,
it's divided into 3 large sections. The first one is about what the Martinezist doctrine can say, and it's an introduction to the doctrines of Martinez de Pasqually to the extent that they are helpful in understanding the Rectified Scottish Rite. And they are, it's baffling in a way. There's a sense in how the doctrines are constructed that defies the linear intellect. And yet, with time, if you can hold on to these baffling assertions and tenets and stories without foreclosing, without laying judgment on them, it isn't long before they open up into a profundity where you can start to see how they invited so many people into a quest of inner development. And then the second part is how the Martinezist doctrine unites with the rituals of the Rectified Scottish Rite in the Solomonic tradition, but then merging that with a Martinezist direction to be a more specific guidance as the operations of the rituals are carried out. And in this, it gets into a number of details. I think it would probably be especially helpful for people who have been through the Rectified Scottish Rite, although I wouldn't know myself, or who have read the rituals, but at least of people, of Freemasons, or people who have worked with Solomon's temple-oriented ceremonies, could see how the Martinezist legacy and the Solomonic legacy combine. And then finally, the Rectified Scottish Rite as a way of awakening, sort of calling back to the titles of those earlier books, how the instructions of the professed and the grand professed can lead to the fruition of reintegration. And in this part of the book, we did these translations of the instructions and have published them. I think that there have been unpublished English translations that have passed through the grapevine for a long time, but this is the first time that they are published, as far as I know. They've been published in French for a long time, so we're not really giving away anything, but it's an opportunity to see how the Martinezist doctrine is introduced in a Solomonic setting. And I think that the writing is both profound and surprisingly clear and succinct by the standards of 18th century, 19th century writing.
That's a good caveat to add on to the end there.
Yes, it's not haiku.
Right. All right. So then how do you think that the professed and grand professed, like that text has something to offer those who have not been initiated into the Rectified Scottish Rite? I mean, you seem very moved by them, so I'm going to assume your answer is yes, but can you maybe explain a little bit why? Like, how are you integrating these works into your life, even though you have not received the degrees?
Well, I am very moved by the works of Saint Martin, and I dwell on his writing and his orientation, and from that, that leads me to interest in Martinez de Pasqually and also in these teachings of the Rectified Scottish Rite. They show facets of the worldview that Saint Martin is expounding. And it's all mysterious. It requires patience to be able to open to these things. So all these different facets are very helpful. And with enough patience and with study, it's possible to see that this isn't random. This is actually planting the seeds of an understanding of a certain kind of gnosis, if you will. And it is not, I'm sure it would be very helpful to have these initiations, to be able to appreciate these instructions in the context in which they were originally intended. But I think in other initiatory, if you have other initiatory experience that is sufficiently resonant with these works, they can also be very helpful. And to be able to, they're like mirrors that enable you to see angles of the deep self that you wouldn't be able to obtain any other way. And I think the natural response to that is just immense gratitude.
I like that a lot. All right, let's talk about where people can find the book. Is it available on Amazon and all?
Sure, it's available on Amazon across the world. If you're not such a fan of contributing to Amazon's hegemony, if you go to waysofawakening.com, we now are working through, I think it's bookshop.org. So you can get it through a local independent bookshop, and part of the proceeds go to supporting independent bookshops. You can do it that way. Also, they're distributed through Ingram, which is one of the largest book distributors in the world. So most bookstores where you order books at all, whether directly through Ingram or whatever ordering company they use, warehousing services they use, directly or indirectly use Ingram. So you can just say, I want this book, and you can order it there. And that's Perfect. Whether you're in the United States or internationally. I deliberately chose Ingram as a distributor because it is possible to for an independent bookstore to get it and to sell it at a decent, at a standard markup. So we don't accept returns. So depending on the bookstore, they may or may not want to get a bunch of them to put on the shelf, but you can certainly special order it.
I've heard that you do accept returns, but that the return counter is in the Imago Templi, so you have to get there first.
Let's say.
Well, thank you very much. In closing, I would like to say that, so that was our second bowl of kava, and it totally... I feel way more spacey. Like you caught me a couple times. I know at one point you're like, about the book. I'm like, okay, right. Where's my brain? But thank you so much. This is, it's such a fascinating journey that you have been on with these books. And I just really enjoy hearing you talk about them. I mean, primarily because this is like an area of Freemasonry that I will never have the opportunity to explore. And it's just really lovely to learn that there are like these other facets of it and these other traditions that are sort of emerging out of it. I do not think that I ever realized when I became a Freemason 20 blah blah years ago how diverse it was. And it is vastly, strangely diverse, like just crazy. Even in the United States, mainstream Freemasonry is the one that everybody knows about, where it's mostly like old guys complaining about their pancreases and talking about replacing the roof on the building or whatever. But even inside mainstream Freemasonry, there's a lot of diversity. And you take one step outside, and it is just a crazy amount. There's just so much out there. It kind of makes it so that I'm not really sure that there's a really good definition of Freemasonry. Should we call it like an initiatory system centered around Solomonic imagery? Like, is that the only thing that they all have in common?
It's sort of, I know it when I see it. I can't define it.
It's basically like vulgarity. But thank you. I really have enjoyed this, and I look forward to you translating another book so that we can do this again.
Yeah. Next year, I expect.
This has been another episode of the Arnemancy Podcast. Thank you for joining me. I have been your host, Reverend Eric. You can find Arnemancy online at arnemancy.com, and you can subscribe to this podcast anywhere podcasts are found. If you like what you hear, please consider supporting the Arnemancy Project for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/Arnemancy.